She had sworn never to love again. After so many mistakes, broken promises, and broken hearts, love had become forbidden territory, something distant and unattainable. For years she had surrendered herself to the comfort of solitude, believing that if she did not allow herself to love, she would not be hurt again. The idea of a new romance? Something unthinkable. She was at peace, or at least she believed she was. But what happens when life decides to surprise you, even when you think you have everything figured out? At 58 years old, she found him. Someone who, in her mind, did not fit into the story she had written for herself. How can a new love emerge when the promise of never falling in love again is the only thing you have kept? And more, is it possible to start over and be happy again when the baggage of the past weighs so heavily? The answer lies in the experience of someone who has lived so much, perhaps more than she should. She soon realized that life, in fact, does not follow the plans we make, no matter how much we try to avoid it. Love, no matter how much we promise never to feel it again, finds a way to appear. And when it does, it brings with it a dilemma that only those who have experienced it can understand. Is it really possible to leave the past behind and allow yourself to experience something new? She found herself faced with this question unintentionally. The past had taught her to be cautious, but the present forced her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about love. The first time she met him was an accident, one of those moments when life simply happens and you can't predict it. It was at a gathering of friends, something simple, a relaxed get-together that she almost didn't go to. It was supposed to be just any night, but he showed up unexpectedly. She was lying on the couch, distracted, looking out the window, when she felt the presence of someone nearby, a feeling she had never experienced again. It was him, the man who had unintentionally invaded her space. What she noticed right away was the serenity he exuded. He wasn't a young man, nor was he conventionally handsome, but there was something about him that seemed genuinely, effortlessly attractive. His eyes had a calmness that she didn't see in many people, something that stood out amidst the noise of the conversations and laughter around them. He approached her with a shy smile and, without beating around the bush, said, "Are you okay? You seem a little distant." That question, so simple and yet so profound, made her look at him with a curiosity that she hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. She smiled back, perhaps more out of politeness than anything else, but deep down she knew this was different. Over the course of the evening, she discovered that his name was Carlos, a 60-year-old man, divorced, with adult children and a consolidated career as a writer. There was nothing extraordinary about his story, but the way he spoke about life touched her in a peculiar way. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, as if he were trying to translate his emotions into something more tangible. Each word seemed to carry weight. There was no rush in his actions, no urgency. He seemed to know what he wanted and at the same time to be comfortable with what life had to offer him. She found herself observing him more than she should have, trying to understand what was happening. He wasn't a flirt. He didn't make empty promises or try to impress her. He was simply there, like someone who puts a gift in your hands and waits for you to decide what to do with it. But she knew that if she accepted what he offered, she would have to let go of the armor she had worn for so long to protect herself. At that moment, she didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to fall in love. She was afraid, very afraid to let herself be touched again. But his presence caused her something that she couldn't identify. There was a mix of comfort and uneasiness, as if she had found something she thought she had lost forever. She didn't know if this was good or bad, if she was allowing herself to experience something she shouldn't, or if finally she could take a step forward. Carlos, on the other hand, wasn't there to force anything. He seemed to understand her space, the silence that formed when she retreated into her own thoughts. Sometimes she found herself wondering if he realized how far she was pulling away, if he saw that her resistance was almost like an invisible shield. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull away completely. Something about Carlos brought her back. Something in his simplicity made her want, for a moment, to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. Their relationship began to build slowly and cautiously, like two pieces of a puzzle that fit together, but with a deliberate movement. They saw each other sporadically, but each encounter had something transformative. Over coffee, he talked about the importance of solitude in his life, something she understood deeply. He didn't see solitude as a sentence, but as a choice, a chance to get to know himself without the distractions of the outside world. This somehow made her think about her own journey, about how she had gotten used to living without a true partner as if it were safer that way. But was it really? The doubt, which had been distant before, was now beginning to settle in more strongly. In one of these encounters, during a walk in the park, Carlos asked her directly, "Are you afraid of loving again?" She didn't answer right away. She didn't know how to put into words what she was feeling. It was a hidden fear, a fear of losing control of her own life, of giving space to something that she knew could be temporary. The idea of being hurt again was terrifying, but at the same time, she felt that something was changing inside her. How could she deny what was beginning to emerge so genuinely and unexpectedly? She then said, "I don't know if I want to love again. I'm afraid of losing the autonomy that I've gained." He looked at her with understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was talking about, but at the same time, he didn't give her ready answers. He wasn't there to convince her, to change her view of love or life. He was simply there, a calm presence that little by little began to break down the walls she had built over the years. She knew she couldn't keep running away. The truth was simple, but hard to face. Maybe it was time to allow herself to start over, to give love a chance, even knowing that the pain could come again. But when she looked at him, she also saw something she had never imagined in her 58 years, the opportunity to build a different story, without rushing, without expectations, but with the certainty that, perhaps, only now could she truly understand what it meant to love someone. She had no idea that that seemingly simple conversation about the fear of love would become the turning point in her life. Ever since Carlos had asked that question, something had begun to change inside her, a silent and at the same time intense process. She was still wondering whether or not to continue with that relationship, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. She could no longer live with the absolute certainty that she would never give herself up again, the fear of losing. Her autonomy still consumed her. She had built a life around herself where she was self-sufficient, where solitude did not seem like a burden, but a choice. She had her own spaces, her own routines, and this gave her a sense of control that she was not willing to give up. But Carlos was different. He did not try to invade her life, nor did he pressure her. He accepted her as she was, with her fears and reservations, without rushing to expect anything in return. And this made her reflect on what was happening to her. Perhaps it was the first time in years that someone had treated her like this, with patience and respect for her own limitations. In the following weeks, she and Carlos began to see each other more often. They would spend hours talking about everything and nothing, walking in the park, drinking coffee, visiting museums, or just sharing silence. What seemed like a simple act of coexistence began to transform into something bigger. There were no promises, no demands, but a subtle complicity that she could not ignore. It was as if somehow they were both finding what they needed in each other, without rushing and without expectations. During one of these meetings, Carlos said something to her that made her stop and think for hours. Sometimes you just have to trust that life will take you where you need to be. Love is just a part of that. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He was simply sharing his vision of the world, a vision that she, until then, hadn't had the courage to consider. For her, love had always been something to be controlled, something that required surrender, but also required you to keep your guard up. He, on the other hand, seemed to see love as a natural part of life, something that happened without warning, without guarantees, but that, when it did happen, was just another expression of who you are and how you connect with the other person. His vision of love moved her deeply. She began to realize that perhaps her fear wasn't about losing control, but rather about allowing herself to be vulnerable again. And that vulnerability, she now understood, wasn't a weakness. It was an opportunity for growth. It was as if, by allowing herself to live in the present with Carlos, she was learning to reconnect with her own humanity, with her own emotions, without worrying about the mistakes of the past or what might happen in the future. But as in any process of change, insecurities continued to arise. One night, as they walked through the quiet streets of the city, she asked Carlos in a more serious tone, "Have you never been afraid to love? Afraid to give yourself up again? After everything you've been through?" He looked at her for a moment with a calm smile and answered, "I was and still am every day. But I realize that fear cannot rule my life. It teaches me to be cautious, but it cannot stop me from experiencing the good things that life has to offer." She lost herself in her own thoughts for a moment, feeling that those words touched something very deep inside her. She felt like she was taking big steps, but each one of them brought her closer to a truth that she had, until then, avoided. The truth that love was not a matter of control or predictability, but of allowing yourself. Allowing yourself to be touched, to be transformed. Allowing herself, once again, to surrender to the flow of life without guaranteeing that the ending would be happy or safe. Their relationship became a delicate dance between caution and surrender. She began to realize that her greatest battle was not the fear of being hurt again, but the fear of opening herself up to what was new and unknown. With Carlos by her side, she began to understand that love did not need to be perfect to be real. It did not need to have all the answers or all the guarantees. It simply existed as something that happened between them, as a bond that formed slowly, but with a strength that she did not imagine she would be able to feel again. What had previously seemed impossible, little by little became a comfortable reality, a reality that she no longer wanted to let go of. She found herself, in one of the many coffees they drank together, thinking about everything that was happening. She thought about how grateful she was for that experience, for that man who had appeared in her life unexpectedly, but with a gentleness that she never imagined she would need. She didn't know exactly what the future held for them, but one thing was clear. She was willing to live in the present, without fear, without rushing to understand everything. For the first time, she felt that she didn't need to have all the answers to surrender to what was happening, to live what was unfolding before her. She didn't know if that love would be eternal, but she knew that, in some way, it had already transformed her, even before any promise or guarantee. And that was, perhaps, enough. Time passed, and what had previously seemed like a friendship with well-defined limits transformed into something deeper and more true. Carlos and she no longer saw each other as just two lonely beings who met by chance. There was something more between them, something that she couldn't define, but that she could feel with every look, every subtle touch, every shared laugh. They began to talk about the future, about their lives, their plans, and she, cautiously, began to allow him to infiltrate her most intimate dreams. That, somehow, made her feel alive again. The truth is that she had never imagined that she would be able to give herself over again. What was happening to her was a rediscovery of love, but this time with a maturity that she had never thought possible. There was no longer the burning desire for a passionate and intense romance. but rather the need for a genuine connection, for something calmer and deeper. Something that was built little by little, without rushing to get anywhere. She began to understand that perhaps love did not need grand gestures or declarations. It was built in the simplest details, in conversations at the end of the day, in silent glances shared at night. Carlos, on the other hand, was never the type of man who demanded anything. He was there without rushing, without demands, and that seemed to be exactly what she needed. He did not have great expectations of her or their relationship. He accepted her as she was, with her insecurities, her baggage, and her fears. He didn't force her to be different. He was just there to be a part of her life, to be someone she could trust, someone she could be vulnerable with without fear of being judged. That, to her, meant more than any promise of eternal love. As the months went by, she began to realize how much his presence calmed her. On difficult days, when memories of the past threatened to come flooding back, he was there to help her find peace. He didn't make her forget what she had experienced, but he made her see that, despite all the difficulties, life had something more to offer. She wasn't alone. She was no longer trapped in a past she couldn't change. And for the first time, she allowed herself to be grateful for this unexpected gift. One night, while they were walking through the city, she told him about her biggest doubt. Carlos, do you think we change? That people can really change? I'm afraid that my past, with everything I've been through, will still be a shadow over what we're creating here. Carlos stopped for a moment, looked at her with his calm eyes, and said, unhurriedly, as he always did, I don't know. If people change, but I know they can grow. Life teaches us to be better, to deal with our wounds, and to try to do things differently. The past doesn't have to be a burden, unless we allow it to be. Change comes with time, with acceptance, and, above all, with the desire to do things more lightly. Those words penetrated her heart in a way she hadn't imagined. She knew that, on some level, he was right. The past was there, but it didn't need to define who she was. She was no longer the woman he had promised never to love again. She was a woman who, for the first time, was willing to give love a chance, even with all the uncertainty that it involved. She didn't know what the future held for them, but something inside her told her that it didn't matter so much. What mattered at that moment was what she was experiencing. Their relationship, which had previously seemed so small and full of restrictions, was now solid, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and understanding. Carlos didn't pressure her, nor did he push her towards a future that she wasn't yet ready to imagine. He was simply there, with her, as a constant and comforting presence. And she, little by little, began to realize that there was no need for grandiose promises to feel complete. The simple fact that he was by her side, accepting who she was enough. She also realized something important. The idea that love needs to be eternal or perfect to be valuable is an illusion. Sometimes, the truest love is the one that teaches you to live in the present, to allow yourself to be who you are without the pressure of a distant future. Carlos wasn't the solution to all her problems, but he became someone with whom she could share the pains and joys of life, someone who made her want to live in the now without worrying about what would come later. One quiet afternoon, while they were sitting in the garden of her house, he looked at her and said with a soft smile, "Are you afraid of taking this step? Of living one day at a time with us, without thinking about what comes next?" She smiled and replied, "Yes, I am. But I don't think I've ever been so willing to try. I'm afraid, but I know that I have someone by my side who makes me want to believe that it's worth it." And, at that moment, she felt that she was ready, not to promise an uncertain future, but to live the present fully with him. She finally understood that love doesn't have to be a guarantee, a fairy tale. He is often simply the acceptance of what is, without demands, without rushing, just two. Hearts connecting at the right time. Carlos' love was not the solution to everything she had experienced, but it was a chance to start over, to build something new, more authentic, and above all, freer. She was ready to experience this without rushing, without fear, just with the desire to go with the flow of what was happening between them. Time now seemed to be their greatest ally. They continued to get to know each other, understand each other, and fall in love in a way that did not require grandiose words or promises full of expectations. With each meeting, with each passing day, she felt stronger, more secure in relation to what she was experiencing. And perhaps for the first time in many years, she truly believed that she had found something that did not need to be perfect, to be real. The love she experienced did not have a definitive end, but she understood that, with him, she was creating something worthwhile, something that deserved to be lived. She realized that the idea of loving at any cost, of expecting a relationship to be perfect, was far from realistic. True love was not about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them. Carlos, with his calm and unhurried presence, had shown her exactly that. He didn't see her as someone broken or damaged by the past, but as a woman who had a history, a baggage, but who was still willing to open herself up to whatever was possible. He, unlike other men in her life, didn't pressure her to change or be different. He simply accepted who she was and, in doing so, gave her the freedom to be herself. Small changes began to happen within her. She felt more confident, more open to new feelings without the burden of the constant fear of being hurt. She was finally understanding that love didn't require control, didn't require her to have all the answers or to live according to a rigid script. The love she was experiencing with Carlos was calm, but also intense. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but about shared silences, knowing looks, and the simple fact of being together. She didn't know what the future held. Maybe, sometime in the future, she and Carlos would go their separate ways. But at that moment, she didn't want to worry about that. What mattered was that she was living in the now, that she was enjoying what she had within her reach. With him, she understood that the present was the greatest gift they could give each other. Sometimes, she caught herself thinking about how life had brought her here to that moment of peaceful happiness. And if someone had told her, years ago, that she would fall in love again after so long, she would have laughed, thinking it was impossible. But here she was, at 58 years old, giving herself over to love in a way she never imagined possible. Love was no longer about expectations and broken dreams, but about simplicity, about mutual acceptance. It was this love that, with patience and time, was teaching her to live fully, without fear of tomorrow or regret of yesterday. That day, while they were having coffee at their favorite place, Carlos said something that touched her deeply. "Have you noticed how we have everything we need now? We don't need anything else other than ourselves." She looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. Carlos wasn't talking about possessions or material achievements, but about what really mattered, the connection between them, the space they had built together, where they could be authentic without pretensions. He wasn't talking about a perfect love, but a real love where imperfections were accepted, where each person could be who they were without having to pretend. And that, for her, was more valuable than any romantic ideal she had ever imagined. She looked at Carlos and smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was no longer searching for a solution or an idealized happy ending. What she experienced there, with him, was already what she needed. She realized that love didn't have a single format. It didn't need to fit into a mold. Love, in fact, was made up of moments like those, simple, true, and shared with someone who accepted her exactly as she was. Throughout the entire process, She understood that no matter how much we close ourselves off from the world, love can still find its way to you. It doesn't matter how long it takes or what you've been through, because at some point, you allow yourself to open up again and rediscover that love can be gentle, kind, and transformative, even at a stage in life when you thought it was too late for a dot. And so, what once seemed impossible and even unthinkable became a sweet and comforting reality. She no longer needed to promise never to fall in love again, nor did she need to be afraid of being hurt again. She had learned to trust the present, to appreciate the beauty of simply being with someone who made her feel alive, and to realize that true happiness lay in the simple act of allowing herself to love again. She now understood that love has no set time to happen, and that it often appears when we least expect it, discreetly and calmly, to teach us the most precious lessons in life. In the end, she knew that the greatest gift she could receive was, in fact, the chance to allow herself to be happy, without fear, without rushing, and above all, without forced promises. Love was there, simply happening, and that was more than enough. Just like her, perhaps you are also discovering that it is never too late to allow yourself to experience true love. And I would love to hear what you think about this journey. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one and share your own experiences in the comments. Let's continue exploring the power of stories that touch the heart together.